My name is Emily, and until recently, I believed my marriage was built on certainty. Not passion that burned too bright or drama that demanded attention, just a quiet, dependable kind of love that felt permanent. Daniel and I had been married for 6 years, together for nearly a decade. We knew each other's habits, routines, silences. Or at least, I thought we did. The first crack didn't arrive with shouting or accusations. It came softly, wrapped in routine. A kiss on the forehead that lingered too long. A question asked too casually, "You working late again?" Followed by a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I noticed the change before I understood it. Daniel had started watching me, not obviously, but with the kind of attention that feels heavier than love. I told myself it was stress. We were both busy. Life does that to people. Still, I felt an unease I couldn't name, like walking through a familiar room rearranged in the dark. The night everything shifted, I came home later than usual. The apartment was quiet, the lights dimmed. Daniel was in the kitchen, pretending to scroll on his phone, though I could feel his awareness sharpen the moment I stepped inside. We exchanged pleasantries, safe, practiced words that avoided the spaces between us. I went to the bedroom to change and reached for my handbag. It was open. That alone shouldn't have mattered. But something about it felt wrong. Exposed. I froze, staring at it as if it might speak. When I looked back toward the kitchen, Daniel was watching me. Not openly. Just enough to let me know I wasn't alone in this moment. A strange tension filled the room, thick and unspoken. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said too quickly. I closed the bag, my hands shaking, and forced myself to breathe normally. Whatever he knew or thought he knew was already changing the ground beneath us. I could feel it. The balance we'd relied on was slipping, replaced by suspicion and fear. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. I wondered what love looks like when trust begins to rot from the inside. I wondered how far doubt could push a person before they did something irreversible. I didn't know it yet, but the question wasn't whether something would break between us. It was who would break first. By morning, the silence between Daniel and me had settled into something solid, almost physical. It followed us through the apartment, pressing against every small interaction. We spoke, but only in fragments, practical sentences stripped of emotion. Coffee. Keys. Schedules. The kind of language people use when they're afraid a real conversation might collapse everything holding them together. Daniel had always been observant, but now his attention felt sharpened by suspicion. He noticed when I checked my phone and how quickly I locked the screen. He noticed the way I hesitated before answering simple questions. I noticed him noticing, and that awareness made me defensive, guarded in ways I didn't recognize in myself. We hadn't argued, not once. That frightened me more than shouting ever could have. Anger burns and fades, but restraint accumulates. It thickens the air. At work, I struggled to focus. My thoughts kept circling back to Daniel's eyes the night before, steady, searching, wounded. I wondered what he had already decided about me. The fear wasn't just that he might accuse me of something I hadn't done, but that he might be right about what I was becoming. I hadn't crossed any physical lines, but honesty had already eroded. That truth sat heavily in my chest. I had grown comfortable sharing parts of myself elsewhere, my doubts, my frustrations, my sense of being unseen. Each time, I told myself it was harmless. Each time, it pulled me further from the man waiting at home. That evening, Daniel cooked dinner. He used to love doing that, turning it into a small performance. This time, there was no music, no commentary. Just the soft scrape of a knife against the cutting board. I watched him from the doorway, struck by how familiar he looked and how distant he felt. "You've been quiet," I said, attempting lightness. "So have you," he replied, without looking up. The words landed harder than either of us expected. He paused, set the knife down, and finally met my eyes. There was something restrained in his expression, as if he were holding back a question he wasn't ready to ask. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he said. The moment stretched. I felt the weight of every possible answer, each one threatening a different kind of damage. I chose the safest lie, silence. No, I said. Nothing. He nodded slowly, accepting my answer without believing it. That quiet acceptance felt like a door closing. That night, as we sat across from each other eating a meal that tasted of nothing, I realized we were no longer standing on the same side of the truth. Something had shifted, not violently, but decisively. Trust doesn't vanish all at once, it thins, thread by thread, until one small movement is enough to tear it apart. And whatever Daniel suspected, he wasn't done looking for proof. The days that followed felt strangely rehearsed, as if Daniel and I were both reading from scripts we hadn't written. He was attentive in ways that felt forced, asking about my day, offering to help, touching my shoulder as he passed behind me. I responded politely, carefully, measuring each reaction so it wouldn't reveal too much. We were circling each other, both aware that something fragile stood between us. I started to notice the smallest shifts in him. How he lingered near my bag when I set it down. How his gaze followed me when I moved from room to room. Once, when he thought I was asleep, I felt the mattress dip slightly and heard the faint rustle of fabric. I didn't turn around. I didn't ask. Pretending not to know felt safer than confronting what I might find out. That pretense didn't last. One afternoon, I came home early, my head pounding with a dull, persistent ache. The apartment was empty, but the quiet felt disturbed, like someone had just left. Daniel's shoes were by the door, his jacket missing. I walked into the bedroom and saw my handbag on the bed, open wider than before. My stomach tightened. Nothing was visibly out of place, yet I felt certain something had been touched. Moved. Considered. I closed the bag slowly, my hands trembling, and sat down beside it. In that moment, fear eclipsed guilt. Not fear of being discovered, but fear of what suspicion can turn love into. When Daniel returned later that evening, he was unusually calm. Too calm. He kissed my cheek, asked about my headache, poured me a glass of water without being asked. His kindness unsettled me more than anger ever could have. We sat together on the couch, the television murmuring in the background. I couldn't focus on the screen. I was watching him instead, his jaw clenched, his leg bouncing slightly, his eyes fixed forward but unfocused. "Emily," he said suddenly. "Yes. Do you trust me?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course I do." He nodded, absorbing the answer, though something dark flickered across his face. "I trust you too," he said, slowly. "I just wish I didn't feel like I'm losing you." The honesty in his voice made my throat tighten. I wanted to tell him everything, not the details, but the truth beneath them. That I felt invisible. That I was afraid of my own restlessness. That I didn't want to lose him. Instead, I stayed quiet. That night, as Daniel went to bed before me, I remained in the living room, staring at my bag on the chair. I thought about how one hidden object had come to symbolize everything unspoken between us. I sensed that Daniel was no longer waiting for answers. He was preparing to force them. And I had no idea how far he was willing to go. The next day began with an uneasy tenderness. Daniel made breakfast, humming softly, as if routine could smooth the tension that had settled between us. I watched him from across the table, searching his face for anger, for accusation, but found only restraint. That unsettled me most. Anger would have been honest. This felt calculated. I left for work carrying a weight I couldn't name. All day, my thoughts circled the same question: what does love become when it's fueled by doubt? I tried to focus, but every notification made my pulse jump, every quiet moment filled with imagined confrontations. When I returned home that evening, the apartment was dim and silent. Daniel wasn't there yet. I placed my bag on the bathroom counter and turned on the shower, hoping hot water would rinse away the day's tension. Steam filled the room, softening the edges of my thoughts. I reached into my bag without looking. What happened next was immediate and overwhelming. A sharp, searing sensation exploded through me, stealing my breath. I dropped to the floor, coughing, eyes burning, panic flooding every thought. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't understand what was happening, only that something was terribly wrong. I must have cried out, because moments later the bathroom door flew open. Daniel rushed in, His face drained of color as he took me in, curled on the tile, gasping, shaking. "Emily, what happened?" he asked, panic cutting through his voice. I couldn't answer at first. My chest burned, my eyes streamed, and my thoughts were scattered shards. When I finally managed to look up at him, clarity arrived with devastating force. The bag. The item inside it. The way he'd been watching me. "You did something," I whispered. His expression collapsed. "I didn't mean God, Emily, I didn't think." The truth didn't need words anymore. It hung between us, heavy and undeniable. He had crossed a line born not of cruelty, but of fear, and I had led us both to its edge with my silence. As the pain slowly eased, something else took its place: grief. Not just for what had happened, but for what it revealed. We were no longer simply husband and wife. We were two people capable of hurting each other in ways we never imagined. Daniel helped me to my feet, his hands shaking. "I was desperate," he said quietly. "I needed to know." I met his eyes, seeing remorse and suspicion tangled together. "And now you do," I replied. But neither of us knew what that knowledge would cost. That night, as we sat on opposite sides of the room, I understood that the worst part wasn't the pain, it was realizing how close we'd come to becoming strangers. The apartment felt different after that, smaller, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. Daniel hovered nearby, unsure whether to touch me, afraid that any gesture might make things worse. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat on the edge of the couch, my throat still raw, my thoughts painfully clear. "I need you to listen," I said at last. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded and sat across from me, his shoulders slumped, his confidence stripped away. For the first time in days, there was no calculation in his eyes, only fear. "I didn't cheat," I began, choosing each word carefully. "But I was close enough that it should scare both of us." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of that sentence. "Then why?" he asked. "Why keep something like that?" "Because I didn't trust myself," I admitted. "And because I didn't want to admit how lonely I'd become." The words tumbled out then, no longer restrained by fear. I told him about the distance I'd felt growing between us, how our conversations had thinned into logistics, how I'd started craving attention simply to feel visible again. I didn't glorify it. I didn't excuse it. I let it stand in its raw, uncomfortable truth. "There was someone at work," I said. "Nothing physical happened. But it mattered more than it should have. And that's on me." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. "I thought I was losing you," he said quietly. "And instead of asking, I tried to catch you." "That's what hurts the most," I replied. "Not that you suspected me, but that you tested me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of regret, of understanding arriving too late, of two people confronting versions of themselves they didn't like. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, Daniel said, "I was wrong." "Yes," I agreed. "And so was I." There was no victory in that admission, only relief. Truth has a way of exhausting you before it frees you. He reached out then, stopping just short of touching my hand. "I don't know how to fix this." "I don't either," I said honestly. But pretending it didn't happen isn't an option. We talked long into the night, not searching for solutions, but naming the damage. Every word felt like stepping onto unstable ground, yet each one brought a strange sense of steadiness. The truth didn't heal us, but it stopped the bleeding. When exhaustion finally settled in, we sat in silence again. This time, it felt different. Fragile, but real. As I went to bed, I realized the story wasn't ending, it was changing. And whether that change would lead us back to each other or further apart was something neither of us could yet see. But at least now, we were facing it together. Morning arrived without relief. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, touching the room gently, as if unaware of the damage done the night before. Daniel was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, his back to me. The distance between us felt wider than the space we shared. Neither of us spoke for a while. Words had been spent, and what remained needed time to settle. I watched him dress in silence, noticing details I'd once found comforting, the careful way he folded his shirt, the pause before he put on his watch. Now, those same details reminded me how easily familiarity can fracture. "I'm taking the day off," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't think I can pretend everything's normal." I nodded. "Neither can I." After he left the room, I sat alone, replaying the events in my mind. Pain has a way of sharpening memory, and every moment felt etched in too clearly. I thought about the fear that had driven him to act, and the avoidance that had driven me to hide. Neither of us had intended harm, yet harm had found its way in. Later that afternoon, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. There was no urgency this time, no accusations waiting to be unleashed. Just two people trying to understand what came next. "We can't go back," Daniel said. "Not to how things were." "I know," I replied. "But maybe that's not the worst thing." He looked at me then, searching my face. "Do you still want this?" he asked. "Us?" The question landed softly, but its weight was immense. I didn't answer immediately. I needed to be honest, not just with him, but with myself. "Yes," I said at last. "But not the version where we stop telling the truth." Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "Then we need help," he said. "Real help." The admission felt like a turning point. Not a solution, but a direction. For the first time since suspicion entered our home, the future didn't feel entirely sealed off. That evening, we walked together without destination, letting the cool air steady our thoughts. We didn't hold hands. We didn't apologize again. Some things don't need repetition, they need action. As we returned home, I understood that trust wouldn't be rebuilt through grand gestures or promises. It would return quietly, if at all, through consistent honesty and the courage to speak before silence turns poisonous. The fire between us hadn't destroyed everything, but it had stripped away illusion. And what remained raw, uncertain, and exposed was the only place where something real could begin again.